High-ranking Nazi generals had already lost the war, but still demanded luxury. How is that even possible? How can men standing on the edge of total collapse act with that level of confidence, almost arrogance? The answer is uncomfortable. Because these weren't ordinary soldiers. These were high-ranking Nazi generals, the elite of a regime that had spent years operating above consequences. Men who gave orders that decided life and death. Men who were obeyed instantly, without question. And deep down, that mindset hadn't changed. May 1945. Germany is collapsing. Cities are burning. Communication is breaking down. Entire divisions are surrendering or disappearing. But in the middle of that chaos, something surreal happens. A convoy appears on a dusty road. Not damaged trucks, not desperate soldiers, but polished black cars. Clean, intact, almost untouched by war. As the vehicles slow down and stop near an American checkpoint, the doors open, and out step men who look like they came from a ceremony, not a battlefield. Perfect uniforms, shined boots, medals carefully displayed, posture straight, faces calm, controlled, no panic, no desperation, just expectation. Because in their minds, status still mattered, rank still mattered, power still mattered. These men weren't thinking like defeated officers. These men were thinking like a privileged class that had simply changed locations. One of the generals steps forward. No raised hands, no sign of surrender. Instead, demands. Clear, direct, unapologetic. A request to meet the highest-ranking American officer immediately. A request for private quarters. A request to remain separated from regular prisoners. And most importantly, a demand for protection. Protection from what was coming from the East. At that moment, something doesn't add up. The war is lost, completely. And yet the tone, the posture, the attitude, none of it reflects defeat. Because these generals believe in something very specific. A belief that rank creates immunity. A belief that officers, no matter the nation, belong to the same class. A belief that Americans will recognize status and respond with respect. In other words, a massive miscalculation. Across the checkpoint stand American soldiers, exhausted, covered in dirt, living on minimal supplies, carrying the weight of months of brutal combat. And now, directly in front of them, stand the very men who helped create that destruction, acting as if none of it applies to them. No apology, no humility, no awareness, just expectations. And that's where the tension begins. Because this situation is no longer about surrender. This is about ego. This is about identity. This is about what happens when people who were treated like untouchable authorities suddenly enter a world where none of that matters anymore. But the most dangerous part isn't the arrogance. The most dangerous part is the misunderstanding. These generals think they've reached safety. Think they've found the right side to surrender to. Think they can negotiate. But there's one critical detail missing from that calculation. The man in charge of this sector isn't interested in negotiations, and definitely not interested in protecting reputations, because the commander behind this line is not going to treat them like officers, not even close. And in just a few moments, everything those generals believed about power, about rank, about control, is going to collapse completely. But right now, standing at that checkpoint, none of that is visible yet. Confidence is still there, posture still unbroken, voice still firm. For a few more minutes, the illusion holds. And that illusion is exactly what makes what comes next so much more brutal. High-ranking Nazi generals were not afraid of the Americans. So what were they really running from? Because men who had commanded armies, who had sent thousands into battle without hesitation, who had built entire strategies around domination and control. Do not suddenly abandon everything without a reason, and yet that is exactly what was happening. May 1945. The war in Europe is collapsing faster than anyone expected. German defenses are breaking apart. Entire units are surrendering without orders. Communication lines are failing. But while chaos spreads across the country, one direction becomes more terrifying than all the others: the East. Because from the East, something unstoppable is advancing: the Red Army. And this is where everything changes. For years, German forces had pushed deep into Soviet territory. This wasn't a normal war. This was a war of destruction. Villages burned, cities destroyed, prisoners starved, entire populations erased. Orders were carried out without hesitation, and the men giving those orders, the same high-ranking generals now standing at American checkpoints, knew exactly what had been done. Every decision, every command, every consequence. So when the Soviet advance began turning into a full-scale collapse of German defenses, something shifted. Not strategy, not tactics. Fear, not the kind of fear soldiers feel in battle. Something deeper, something personal. Because this time, the roles were reversing. The same force that had once been pushed back was now coming forward with overwhelming speed, relentless, unstoppable, and not interested in negotiation. Stories began spreading, not official reports, not confirmed briefings. Stories, whispers moving faster than any military order, captured officers disappearing within minutes, executions without delay, endless columns of prisoners being marched east, never to return, frozen labor camps, no rank, no status, no privilege, just consequences. And the most terrifying part? Every high-ranking officer understood one simple truth: there would be no protection. Not for generals, not for commanders, not for anyone connected to what had happened in the East. Titles meant nothing there. Medals meant nothing. Authority meant nothing. Because in that direction, the war wasn't about rules anymore. It was about payback. And that realization broke something inside the German command structure. Because suddenly, survival became more important than pride, more important than orders, more important than everything they had built their identity around. So a decision was made. Not officially, not written down, but carried out anyway. Move west, not to regroup, not to fight, to escape, to surrender, but only to the right side. The side believed to be controlled, predictable, civilized, American forces. Because there was still one belief holding everything together. A belief that the Americans would follow the rules, that they could respect rank, that they would treat officers as officers, that there would be structure, order, safety. In other words, a controlled defeat, a comfortable surrender. And that belief created a dangerous illusion, because instead of preparing for consequences, these generals prepared for negotiation. Instead of accepting reality, they carried expectations. And instead of fear being visible on the surface, it was hidden behind posture, tone, and behavior. Calm voices, straight backs, confident demands. But underneath all of that was something else entirely. Because every single one of those men knew exactly what would happen if the wrong army reached them first. That's why the requests at the checkpoint weren't random. Private quarters, separation from other prisoners, protection. Every demand pointed to the same thing: control, distance, safety from one specific threat. And here's where the situation becomes even more dangerous. Because fear, when hidden behind arrogance, turns into miscalculation. These generals believed they had already made the correct move, believed they had escaped the worst outcome, believed they were now in a position to negotiate their future. But there was one critical mistake in that entire plan. A single assumption that was about to collapse everything. Because the man in charge of the American forces they had just approached understood fear better than they did, understood exactly what they were trying to avoid, and more importantly, understood how to use that fear against them, which means that what those generals saw as safety was about to become something else entirely. Not protection, not negotiation, but something far more controlled and far more devastating. Because in just a few moments, that hidden fear they tried so hard to suppress was going to be dragged to the surface and turned into a weapon that wouldn't require a single bullet, but would still break them completely. High-ranking Nazi generals made one critical mistake, not on the battlefield, not in strategy, but in a single moment of arrogance, a moment that cost them everything. How can power disappear in seconds? How can men who once controlled entire armies suddenly become nothing? The answer begins at that checkpoint. Because what happened next wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, it was controlled, and that made it far more devastating. The requests had already been made. Private quarters, separation from other prisoners, special treatment, protection. Every word carried the same assumption: that rank still mattered, that status still had value, that the old rules still applied. But standing on the other side of that checkpoint was a completely different reality. American soldiers didn't react the way those generals expected. No salutes, no respect, no recognition, just silence. Cold, heavy silence. Rifles held steady, eyes locked forward. And for the first time, something subtle begins to shift. Not externally, internally. Because when arrogance meets indifference, it starts to crack. Word of the situation travels quickly up the chain of command. Reports of high-ranking Nazi generals making demands, expecting comfort, expecting privilege, expecting control, and eventually that information reaches one man, George S. Patton, a commander known not just for aggression, but for understanding something far more powerful than force: psychology. Because breaking the body is one thing. Breaking identity is something else entirely. And that's exactly what is about to happen. When Patton arrives, the atmosphere changes immediately. Not because of volume, not because of visible anger, but because of presence. The kind of presence that doesn't need to announce itself. The kind that makes people straighten their posture without being told. The generals see him, and instinctively, they react. Posture sharper, chins higher, salutes ready. Because in their minds, this is the moment everything returns to normal. Officer meets officer. Rank recognizes rank. Structure restores order. But that expectation lasts only seconds. Because Patton doesn't return the salute, doesn't acknowledge the rank, doesn't recognize the status. He simply looks, and that look alone carries something unsettling. Not respect, not negotiation, disgust, pure, unfiltered. And suddenly, the invisible structure those generals relied on begins to collapse. One of the generals steps forward, still trying to hold on to control, still speaking with authority, listing rank, years of service, expectations under the rules of war, attempting to restore the hierarchy. But something is different now. The words no longer carry weight, because authority only exists when someone else accepts it. And in this moment, no one does. Patton listens, not interrupting, not reacting, letting the general speak, letting the illusion stretch just a little longer. And then he responds. Short, direct, final. No recognition of rank, no acceptance of status, only a complete rejection of everything those men believed they still were. And then the real shift begins. Orders are given, immediate, unquestioned. American military police step forward, and in seconds, the transformation starts. Medals removed, insignia torn away, symbols of power stripped from uniforms that once represented authority. For a career officer, this isn't just humiliation, this is erasure, because rank isn't just a title, it's identity, and without it, there is nothing left to stand on. Protests begin. Voices rise, arguments about rights, about rules, about treatment, attempts to regain control, but every word falls flat. Because the system they're trying to appeal to no longer exists here. More orders follow. Vehicles confiscated, luggage taken, servants separated, every layer of comfort, every symbol of status removed piece by piece, systematically, deliberately, until nothing remains. And then comes the final instruction. Not shouted, not dramatic, but absolute. Move. Not to private quarters, not to protected areas, but to the same place as everyone else. A muddy, overcrowded prisoner enclosure, filled with exhausted, broken soldiers. The same soldiers those generals once commanded. The same soldiers sent into impossible situations. The same soldiers abandoned during retreat. And now, no separation exists, no hierarchy, no distance, just equality in defeat. And that is the moment everything collapses. Because physical loss is one thing, but losing identity, losing status, losing the belief that you are different from everyone else, that breaks something deeper, something irreversible. And yet, even after all of that, one final mistake is about to be made. One last attempt to hold on to control, one last refusal to accept reality, and that mistake will trigger something far worse than humiliation. Because what comes next won't just strip away status. It will destroy what's left of their confidence completely. What kind of threat can destroy a man without a single shot? Not wound him, not imprison him, but break something inside, instantly. Because by this point, everything had already been taken. Status, gone. Rank, erased. Control, stripped away. High-ranking Nazi generals were no longer standing as commanders, just prisoners, standing in mud, breathing the same air as the soldiers they once commanded. But even then, something remained. A thin layer of resistance, a final attempt to hold on to dignity, because identity doesn't disappear quietly. It fights to survive. And that's exactly what happens next. One of the officers steps forward again. Not loudly, not aggressively, but with controlled tension, still trying to appeal to something, to rules, to structure, to what used to exist. A complaint is made about treatment, about rights, about what should be provided under the laws of war. An attempt, one last attempt, to restore a sense of order, to regain even a fragment of control. And for a brief second, it almost feels like the moment might pass, like the situation might stabilize. But that's exactly where everything shifts, because the response doesn't come with anger, doesn't come with shouting. It comes with something far more dangerous. Calm. George S. Patton steps closer. Not quickly, not aggressively, just enough to close the distance. Eye level, direct, unavoidable. And then he speaks. Low voice, controlled, precise. No emotion, no hesitation. A single message. If there is one more complaint, if there is one more demand, if there is one more attempt to negotiate, every single one of those men will be loaded onto trucks, driven east, and handed directly to the Red Army. No ambiguity, no exaggeration, just a clear outcome. And in that moment, everything stops, because this isn't just a threat. This is the one outcome every single one of those generals had been trying to avoid, the one direction they ran from, the one reality they refused to face. And now, it's placed directly in front of them, not as possibility, but as a decision. And suddenly, all the remaining resistance disappears. Posture breaks, eyes drop, breathing changes, because fear doesn't need time. Real fear is instant. Real fear doesn't build, it hits. And when it hits, it takes everything with it. No more arguments, no more references to rules, no more expectations. Just silence. Heavy. Total. Because in that moment, something becomes painfully clear. There is no negotiation. There is no protection. There is no system left to appeal to. Only consequences. And the realization lands all at once. Survival is no longer about status. It's about obedience, immediate, complete, without question. The officer who stepped forward steps back, head lowered, voice gone, and without another word, movement begins, not forced, not pushed, but understood. Because no further instruction is needed. The direction is clear. Forward. Into the mud. Into the crowd of prisoners. Into the reality that cannot be avoided anymore. No separation, no privilege, no identity left to protect. And that is the moment everything ends. Not with violence, not with execution, but with something far more final. Acceptance. Because once a man understands he has no power left, he stops resisting. And that's exactly what happened. The same men who once commanded armies now follow orders without hesitation. The same voices that once gave commands now remain silent. The same presence that once demanded attention now disappears into the mass, completely. And that is why this moment matters, because it proves something most people never fully understand. Power isn't just taken. It collapses. The moment the illusion behind it is exposed. And in this case, it didn't take bullets. It didn't take force. It took one sentence, one precise threat, delivered at the exact moment it mattered most. Because sometimes, the most effective way to break someone is not to destroy them physically, but to confront them with the one reality they fear more than anything else, and make it unavoidable. So the question is, was that justice? Or was that something else entirely? Because from that moment on, nothing about those men would ever be the same again.